The plight of the Sega 32X is well known to many of you. Launched in late 1994 as a band-aid to new competition and Sega's own uncertainty with its Saturn platform, it received only a handful of games and was dropped after less than a year on the market. To this day, it is considered one of the most prolific failures of any major gaming company, and an important part of why Sega would exit the home hardware business some years later. Much of the library that would come to Sega's 32-bit add-on would be little more than Genesis and Sega CD titles with minor enhancements to color and sound. Some games were so close, they were hard to tell exactly where the enhancements were. The last game released for the platform in the US came in March of 1996, Spider-Man Web of Fire. Developed by Blue Sky Software, it is often lambasted by many in the gaming media, including some rather unflattering reviews at the time of its release. But was this game as bad as many say it is? It had the rather unfortunate position of ending a platform that never really got started, but does it deserve the hate so many seem to heap on its shoulders? In this episode, we will take a look at the 32X exclusive Spider-Man Web of Fire and see what all the fuss was about. The story of Spider-Man Web of Fire has the evil group Hydra covering New York City in a massive plasma web that keeps everything from escaping. Pandemonium ensues, but fortunately your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is in there to help swing the tide of the conflict. Gameplay is built around a simple 3-button interface. You have a punch combo for normal attacks, a web blaster to hold and damage enemies, and of course a jump. Double tapping the jump allows you to swing long distances, and you have the ability to crawl on surfaces like the sides of buildings. And that's it. From there, you pretty much have an army of foot soldiers that all look the same, doing the same things. Spidey starts out on the rooftops, but stages soon open up to bridges, oil refineries, and Hydra's headquarters. In order to keep your web blasters and life charged, there are icons all over the playfield to collect. You can also find additional lives and Daredevil icons. Once you rescue Daredevil, you can use his ability to damage everything on the screen as long as you have an icon for it. Levels do end in a boss fight, of course, usually against an enemy that can take a fair bit of damage and has a generator that needs to be destroyed. These fights are honestly a joke, however. The AI is so stupid, all you need to do is find a place to hit them where they can't attack back. Despite its billing as a 32-bit action platformer, it plays no different than something you would have encountered on the Genesis in 1990. In fact, the animation takes unusually long to play out, resulting in Spider-Man feeling slow and unresponsive. The web-slinging mechanic is easy enough to employ and does feel decent, but the ability to stick to surfaces and crawl on them is half-baked, and almost completely unnecessary most of the time. You will even find yourself sticking to some surfaces you never wanted to. Without any real innovation presented in the way you confront your enemies, the gameplay here is little more than what we played on 8-bit consoles. A disappointing reality for an add-on claiming to represent a new generation of must-own software. As the 16-bit era began to come to a close, digitized and pre-rendered assets became all the rage. I always felt this was a terrible trend, and I much preferred the traditional hand-drawn visuals we had received before. Unfortunately, Web of Fire uses pre-rendered sprites to bring you that next-generation feeling, and falls flat on its face. Spider-Man and his enemies are all animated well enough, but they are small and not particularly well defined. Backgrounds have multiple layers of parallax scrolling, but are drab and lifeless. Stronger enemies aren't menacing at all and look almost comical, kinda like claymation. The entire visual presentation just lacks appeal, and there is little here that Genesis couldn't have done on its own to similar effect. In fact, remove the 32X from the equation, and you will see that Genesis is handling just about everything in the background. Blue Sky Software was the company that had done the Vectorman series, and no joke, Vectorman is far more impressive than this visually. This was a huge problem with the 32X at the time. Much of its software simply failed to really separate itself from what the Genesis was capable of without it. A lot of the stuff looks so similar, it could easily be assumed the 32X wasn't needed at all. The thing is, this wasn't some third-party mishap you could blame on Acclaim or Activision. Web of Fire was published by Sega themselves. It was developed by a company that had done decent work before. It was part of a licensing deal with Marvel that had spanned many years and multiple titles. Games like this should have been more impressive. They should have shown off what the 32X could do. Instead, we got essentially a 16-bit game with 1989 gameplay. It was a kick in the teeth to everyone that had weathered the 32X storm. There's even some slowdown and graphical glitches, if you can believe it. The sound and music in Spider-Man Web of Fire is not terrible, but much like the rest of the game, it's utterly forgettable. The tunes are lost in the background and have really no bearing or meaning on the gameplay. I've isolated some tracks so you can give them a chance. Web of Fire's biggest problem is that it's a dud with little substance. Nothing here is terrible to the point of labeling it a broken mess, but it also has almost nothing going for it. The gameplay is as simple as action games get. Swing, punch a few enemies, and you have the entire game in a nutshell. You never feel like anything you do matters because it's all so simple. Remember the older games this license was attached to on other Sega platforms? You get to do just as much in those as you do in this one without the $160 add-on. You could even argue the graphics were better in those older games. Sega had a real identity problem with the 32X. They needed games, but much of the stuff they produced never showed any of the platform's more impressive features. Just take a moment and look at this game. Look at its sprites and backgrounds. Look at its animation. Listen to its sound. There are games on the Genesis that absolutely destroy this in all aspects of its presentation. Where are the special effects? How about a 2.5D web in the sky that added some wow factor? Make the characters out of polygons. Something, anything that would have added a note of power that you could argue honestly the Genesis would have a hard time doing alone. Instead, we are left with a very plain looking and sounding game with gameplay that offered nothing beyond the most average titles of the 8 and 16-bit eras. This critique can be applied to much of the 32X's software, an almost defining attribute of Sega of America's mindset at the time. Reviewing a 32X title comes with a few certainties. You are almost always going to have to face the failure of the unit and Sega's decision to create it in the first place. The fate of pretty much every game it received was tied to these factors. Development cycles were short, teams were small, and budgets were thin. These games were shat out with the intention of getting something on the shelves, not to create impressive, genre-defining spectacles. While Spider-Man Web of Fire is far from the worst game I've ever played, its biggest offense is the fact that it does nothing particularly well. On a platform screaming for quality, it was just another action title you could beat in 25 minutes. And that was another problem the game had. It was really short. Once you get the simple gameplay down, you could beat it in no time. And you know what the very best part of the story is? Sega had the audacity to charge $70 for this. When you read about the history of this great company, you will happen across a great many opinions as to why they no longer make consoles. For me, seeing a game like Web of Fire on the store shelves for $70 for an ill-conceived dead platform encapsulates everything wrong with the company. There was an element within Sega that believed just because you put it on the shelf, customers would buy it. You can lay blame on whoever that was and why, but the truth is, the other gaming companies that have weathered their own ups and downs and are alive today knew better than to shit the shelves full of games no one wanted. While Sega is certainly responsible for some of the best games this hobby has ever seen, it was these kinds of releases that would damage the brand in the long term. There was a stretch of time where Sega's reputation took a nasty blow again and again, and software like this didn't help it one bit. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.